So thank you again for being with us today for Biz Talk. And thank you, Chris, for joining us to fill us in on the budget that New Hanover County recently passed. If you have questions today for Chris, please put them in the Facebook comments if you're watching this live on Facebook and not the rebroadcast. So Chris, to jump in, I'd say probably the number one question we've been hearing about the budget this year is, while the tax rate went down, a lot of people's property taxes went up because of the revaluations. So could you kind of take us through a little bit that process and why you recommended this level and why the commissioners passed this level, even though it will still mean a property tax increase for a lot of property owners?
Sure, Robin, and thank you for the invitation. Always glad to talk about the work of the county, and what the most pressing topic is, obviously, is the budget. But I think we've got to level set first and understand that the North Carolina law requires counties to revalue property every 8 years. The county commission, more than a decade ago, perhaps 2 decades ago, made the decision to do revaluation every 4 years. And there have been exceptions to that when there were challenges to the base. Hurricane Fran comes to mind in the 1990s. Obviously, the Great Recession, 2008, 2009, those things were impacting the value of property. So we are on the 4-year schedule. There was an average 32, almost 33% increase in the base, which allowed us to take the rate that has been 55.5 cents for the past several years to a rate of 47.5. And that 47.5 is inclusive of 5.3 cents that's reserved exclusively for prior voter approved debts. So those are for debt services that the voter said, please go out, issue the debt. That's the money that we're raising. And then the balance, the 42 cents, is associated with running the operations of the county government. Revenue neutral was and is 42.5 cents. But the commission has been very clear about what it wanted to achieve in terms of priorities. And so part of the priority and the obligation is meeting prior expenses. There are things that prior boards chose to do and that the county commission has not said stop doing. So we have to fund those. But on the front of, particularly around public education and teacher pay, the county commission said we are going to ensure that we have the best paid teachers in North Carolina. And the way to achieve that is increasing the local supplement. So it's nearly doubling from about $4,500 on average to $9,000. So when you put in the priorities of what the commission wanted to do, other things within its budget, economic development, public safety, and then prior obligations, the best sustainable rate that I could recommend was 47.5. And again, 5.3 of that is reserved to pay for debts, prior voter approved debts. And so I recommended 47.5 and had to work within a set of constraints that are given to us by the county commission. One of those is to minimize fees in taxes. But in addition to minimizing, we have to preserve fund balance. The board does not want to use one-time money for recurring costs. The board has said don't overestimate the amount of sales tax revenue that may come in, as an example. So when you consider all of the constraints that are given to us, the rate that I could recommend to the board that funds the services that we are doing, the services that the board wants to do, and also to allow for growth in the out years, 47.5 cents was the right rate. And I can say administratively that 47.5 cents, when you assume growth through sales tax and growth in the base, that 47.5 cents will carry us over the course of the next 4 years through the current revaluation schedule. So I don't imagine, unless the commission comes back and resets priorities, chooses to go much bigger in a number of places, I am of the firm opinion that 47.5 is the rate that our community will pay now for not only the fiscal year that we're getting ready to enter, but the 3 years that come after. So I know, Rob, that was a long-winded response, but I'm trying to address all of the nuances that are in your question, and certainly the things that I've heard, and I know that the commission has heard since we put the recommended budget out on May 17th.
So quickly, what are some of the previous debts, the previous commitments that the commission's made that is wrapped into some of the funding here that people may have forgotten about?
Sure. So let's focus on debt. We approved a community college bond in 2008. 2 years before that, we approved a parks bond. In 2014, we approved another $60 million school bond. And so those are debts that we have to raise property taxes to pay for that. When the county issues those general obligation bonds, it is saying to the bondholders, the entities that purchase, the county commission will establish a rate via the property tax that is commensurate with the cost of funding those debt obligations. And so there are tens of millions of dollars of prior debts that we're paying, and we're able to accomplish that within 5.3 cents. Now, there are induced operating expenses. You know, when we built out our parks system, certainly we did it with bond money, but that also increases operating costs. When we built the new facilities at the community college, it's not just the debt. By the way, the county is responsible for the operations of those facilities, the capital side. Same thing with the school system. So when we approve debts, there are also induced operating costs that we have to absorb in the general fund budget. But then there's a whole range of public priorities that have been established before. Look at the things that have been happening in economic development for the last 8 or 9 years. Our commission has made public safety a top priority in ensuring that the sheriff has the things that his office needs to be successful. And there was no will, and I agree with that. There was no will to undo or stop doing the important services that our community has come to know and trust and want. That includes the museum, the library. We have an obligation to run the court system, even though that's a state function. We run elections, we run health and human services. There's just a litany of things that prior boards have committed to doing that add value to our community that we need to keep meeting. But there were also things that this commission wanted to do and was committed to doing to ensure that we have a safe, healthy, and vibrant community going forward. And again, 47.5 cents, which is below the prior year tax rate. It is above revenue neutral, but 47.5 was the rate that I felt I could responsibly recommend and do the things that we've committed to and set up a foundation for the board to do the things that it wants to do.
Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between the county and the school system. And so as you mentioned, you know, one of the big changes in the budget is the teacher supplement. So I guess first, can you clear up, are New Hanover County teachers now getting the largest supplement in the state, or are they now the highest paid in the state? And then part two of that question is kind of take us through the thinking behind that and the importance of, you know, why you and the commissioners wanted to focus on that this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the answer to both questions is yes and yes, at least generally speaking and on average. And the way I say that is that teachers, whether they teach in New Hanover County or Jones County or Mecklenburg County, their salary is based on a state schedule. And a teacher with 5 years of experience will get the same base salary in New Hanover as it does in Jones or Mecklenburg. Where the difference comes is the ability and the choice of counties to increase that state pay that's on a fixed schedule with supplements. And most counties, not all 100, but the vast majority do some form of supplement. So based on the appropriation that the board has now approved, on average, our teachers next year will receive a supplement that is $9,000. That is, on average, the single largest supplement in North Carolina. Will there be teachers in other counties because of their length of service that make more perhaps than a teacher here? Yes, but on the whole and on average, teachers with equivalent years of experience, a teacher locally should and will make more money because of that $9,000 supplement. And that supplement's several hundred, perhaps as memory serves me, nearly $500 more than the highest supplement offered by, I believe it's Mecklenburg County.
So one question we got from Facebook on that is if outcome measures has been established to determine if this extra funding ends up making a difference for students. So how do you judge this investment, 3-4 years down the road or however long?
Great question. And that is something that, and I hope folks have watched the discourse and listened to the conversation between the school board and the Board of Commissioners and Dr. Faust and his team. They're very clearly laying out metrics that will prove that our school system is better in 3 years and 5 years than it is today. And there's nobody here, in my opinion, who's going to suggest we don't have a rather high performing school system now. On the whole, we certainly have schools that have challenges and there's a priority to improve that, but our data comprehensively is good and comparable to others. But the expectation is that we will have the best school system in North Carolina. The Board of Education, the Board of Commissioners believes in the plan that Dr. Faust has identified. But you can look right now at state metrics in terms of reading proficiency, math proficiency, the overall composite scores of schools. We have some schools that are in the very top tier of performance in the state. The objective, the need, the commitment is that is the level of performance that we'll be able to achieve in every school in this community.
So let's shift to business development, economic development. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I think the big change or addition this year is the county's relationship with the chamber. And so there's new funding for the chamber to focus on small business or business retention, or can you kind of take us through what the purpose of that is?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And in fact, the board's making two big new commitments, both in the chamber and in WBD, to do very different things. Your question was specific to the chamber, so let's start there. We have recommended first year, and then based on performance, and I have every reason to believe that there's going to be great success years 2 and 3. The commission has funded a small business startup and retention program that will be led by the chamber. That's been an identified gap in our community for years, recognized by the chamber, recognized by WBD, but there's finite capacity with the resources that are in place. And so the board wanted to make that commitment to look at how small business is able to grow to the next level where there is fledgling business ideas. How is it that the chamber helps those businesses get started and off the ground, so to speak? On the WBD side, the commission has made it a priority to build out the blue clay property that we own near the detention center, to turn that into a business and commerce park. It's been working quietly, but working nonetheless for the past several years to do analysis, site planning, and it's now ready to go to the next stage with putting in the infrastructure, water, sewer, the road system, building that out. And that's something that WBD is going to lead for us. So there are other investments in economic development, but I think those are the two highlights in the bookends. And then obviously WDI as well. Wilmington Downtown is doing great work. They have supported and helped the county navigate Project Grace. And again, there are metrics in place that are looking at how does WDI help increase the viable footprint of business in the downtown area.
So let's talk a little more in terms of the gap you talked about that existed before, probably in the small business arena, or I don't know if it's kind of a welcome to the community or folks that are already here and them having resources to help grow in our community. So explain a little more kind of what the county's thinking as to how the chamber will fill this gap and, how they're going to interact with businesses.
Yeah, absolutely. So the chamber has its ear to the ground. It knows where there is business that's trying to get started, but just because of its scale, it's not going to qualify for state incentives. And if it's not going to qualify for a state incentive, highly unlikely that the county, or don't want to speak for the city, or that the city would likely incentivize that, because the incentive comes with the ability to leverage local and state money. But we have example of small business entrepreneurs who are doing incredible things in this community. And where do they go to build the resource, the network connections, understand how to navigate the development process, business permitting, ultimately access to capital? And that's not what this program is about. This is not seed money for angel investing. This is to help businesses that have concrete ideas kind of evolve and start. But if they're small business, they have 4 or 5 employees and they're ready to scale and double to 8 or 10, what can the chamber do, again, to help connect them to the network and the resources across the community and across the state, match them up with partners to help them achieve what they want to do? That's not something that the county does. And even if we did it, I don't know that we would be very good at it. That is what the chamber does. And there was no better entity to partner with on that. Just as WBD is focused on larger business recruitment and expansion of what is here, where it begins to trigger into the incentive side of things.
So let's talk a little bit about the county came into a bunch of other money recently as well, with $300 million that ended up with the county from the sale of the hospital. And then I believe it was $45 million that came in from the CARES Act. So let's divide those up. So first, explain the $300 million from the hospital sale. Is any of that being used yet? And what is the county's approach with those funds?
Yeah, so this budget does not appropriate any of the corpus. So of the 300 million, the board is not cracking into any of the principal. In that we received the money in February, it has been parked in very conservative. Our investment strategy to begin with is conservative by choice, but also by state statute, has been parked in a very conservative place. And actually the investment policy is going to go to the board at the next meeting and ask them to approve, how do we invest the 350 million? So there's 300 that's revenue stabilization, another 50 million for mental health substance use disorders. And so there's really no interest of any discernible value from either of those funds that could have been appropriated in the current year. So let's go back to the constraints issue. For folks that were watching the discussion about the merger with Novant, there was a very high standard set in the asset purchase agreement about how and when the county would tap into the corpus, the 300 million, because the idea is to take that 300 and grow it over time and maximize the interest earnings to invest, and what's not invested would roll back in to the principal. It requires a supermajority of county commissioners to use any of that principal. So 4 of 5 commissioners need to agree to that. That was one of the constraints. There was, and this is something that from a staff perspective and commissioners talked about, do we in year 1 use any of the principal? And there were not 4 of 5 commissioners who agreed with that. So there was no ability for the county from an administrative perspective to assume that to be any of the incoming revenues. And so that's the standard that's going to be in place in perpetuity, that to use the principle of the $300 million revenue stabilization requires 4/5. It also assumes that it is for unexpected expenses, one-time expenses, not to fund the going concern, the continuation budget of the county government. And these are things that you will find embedded in the asset purchase agreement. As it relates to, and it's not CARES Act, so that's kind of 2 and 3 bills ago. The money that the county has available is a little bit more than $45 million. It's known as the American Rescue Plan. That is something that the board charged us upon receipt to develop a plan to reinvest that money in the community over the next 2 to 3 years. And so I hope your viewers have seen that plan. There are absolutely things that we are substituting American recovery money as opposed to using general fund money to do. There's about $1 million of things that are in ARP that would have otherwise been embedded in the budget. But on the flip side, I can also say there are at least $15 million of that $45 million that are county priorities that likely would have found their way over the next 2 to 3 years into a recommended budget, which would have taken general fund money and or sales tax, property tax, sales tax to accomplish. Broadband access, that's something that the county commission, the city council as well, have identified as a priority for our houses that have limited access. And it's not that the connectivity isn't there, it's there, it's to the curb, it's the ability to afford that access. There's $5 million in the ARP plan that's going to fund mental health and school-based health functions over the next couple of years. Those were priorities that the commission was going to move toward. And so what we're able to do, rather than go to the taxpayer in our general fund budget, we're going to be able to fund those things over the next 2 or 3 years through the American Recovery Plan. So we are using ARP. There are things that were in the requested budget that we've substituted revenue, but there are also things that we didn't push into the recommended budget that were clear priorities because we could use ARP money over the next 2 to 3 years. And that's the plan horizon for the board. The connectivity is for 2 years. The school-based mental health support and school health support is over the course of 3 years. The board's going to do $2.5 million of business grants to help, particularly those that are in the service and leisure business that are still recovering from the pandemic. So that $45 million was not imagined by the Congress to say, okay, run your county government or your municipal government with this infusion of cash. It still has a connectivity, a nexus to responding to and recovering from the pandemic. And so we've been able to use what would have been priorities of this commission. We've been able to use ARP money to fund much of that for the next 2 to 3 years. And so I could suggest to you conservatively, there's at least $5 million that's not in the budget that the board approved that otherwise likely could have and would have been part of our recommendation, which is more than the equivalent of a full penny on the tax rate.
So going back 1 minute to the $300 million from the hospital sale. So it sounds like outside of, a hurricane recovery or special need like that, which might dip into the principal, in terms of the income off of that, I mean, is it right to think of that as almost a smaller version of the community foundation that, that eventually is going to throw off 10, 15 million a year that you all will use for special projects or not regular operating items? Is that how you guys are thinking about it?
Yes, generally speaking, and it may not be projects. It may be that if there is a future bond that requires general obligation support, as opposed to using the property tax, perhaps the board can pledge the interest proceeds off of $300 million to pay for the debts, whether it's affordable housing or a school bond. And not suggesting that's what the commission wants to do, but those interest earnings become a revenue that will serve as a substitute for what otherwise would have been property tax or sales tax money. Tapping into the principal would be as it was imagined at the point of approval for one-time unplanned expenditures. I'm going to use Florence as an example. That was an event that's riddled us now for multiple years, but it lasted intently for 4 to 5 weeks. We had to write a $35 million check out of the county fund balance to pay for those costs. Well, opposed to draining down fund balance and separating from the policy that's in place 18 to 21%, and that's why we have the AAA bond ratings that we have, the revenue stabilization fund would have been a reasonable source to write checks to the value of $30+ million. 2008 and 9, when the economy tanked, there was a significant undercollection of revenues. Well, that would be an appropriate revenue replacement. When you have funded the government and expect to raise X and you only get Y, that's an unexpected expenditure. Doesn't mean you're not structurally balanced. There were just things in the environment that changed performance. The board could go to the stabilization fund and use that as a source of revenue replacement, as an example. There may be a time when the board has a debt obligation that it doesn't want to issue debt, but it views it as a one-time expense, perhaps paid out over 3 to 5 years, may go to that principal and say, let's take X out and basically self-finance and use the principal over 2, 3, 4, 5 years to pay for a debt. So there's a lot of imagination there for what could be used. It just was never intended to be the financial support to run the government's current expense and operating costs.
It seems like the 300 million was a bit of a random number in terms of how it ended up with the whole deal. Is there a number you would never want to see that fund go below and it starts to impact our bond rating or could have other ramifications? Or do you feel like it should really stay at that 300 million?
The 300 million really is at this point unrelated to our bond rating. Our bond rating is informed by lots of things, but a huge piece of that is fund balance, which is a separate cash reserve that is about $60 million today that's available for unexpected expenditures for the board to use. Conservatively speaking, as the manager, I would like to see the 300 million grow to 310 or 320 over the next 4 or 5 years. But that's a decision that ultimately has to be made by the board. Again, we're taking an investment policy to them in the future. I don't know that there is a floor that it should be. To sit here and say it will never dip or should never go below 300 million isn't fair to the community. It isn't fair to the taxpayers. It isn't fair to the county commission. But to manage on a daily basis, to not use what effectively is one-time money for current expenses, I think does make for good management. And so where we can use that fund for current expenses, in my opinion, is when we get to the point of having interest proceeds that do serve as a substitute for property tax or sales tax.
So last question, I know we need to wrap up soon, but the final bullet on the county press release was about the county's nearly 2,000 employees in terms of this budget investing in them in terms of pay and benefits. Can you explain what that was? Yeah, sure. So what the board authorized was a market adjustment of at least 2.9%. Our team has carried the lion's share, and I'm not minimizing the work of anybody. And I know that private employers have been terribly impacted by the pandemic, but the public service response has been disproportionately managed and led, and I think well, by the county. So the board wanted to invest in folks for recognizing the work that they have done, not to mention the work that they do to keep the general government running. So there is a 2.9% market adjustment. There's a merit pool that in time we'll be able to determine how to allocate that across the enterprise for high meritorious service. That's a 1% pool that is available. We've been able to keep
And this is good for everybody, the taxpayers as well. We've been able to keep our cost of healthcare flat. There is no increase for the county, which means there's no increase for any of our taxpayers. There's no increase for the employee share of healthcare. So we've been able to do some really good things that I think are financially sound and reasonable and are not associated with what the tax rate ought to be by investing in our folks. We've done it in an affordable, sustainable way that had no bearing on that 47.5 cents that I recommended.
So this is the final question, since I just thought of it. So how, I mean, given those increases, but given the staff shortages that everybody's feeling in the community now, you know, is the county having trouble filling positions? And I mean, do you think you're going to have to increase wages further to fill positions?
You know, one of the things the board did fund, and it's a bit of a longer time examination, is a pay and classification study. It's been 6 or 7 years since we last did that to let the market answer for us whether or not our wages are competitive. We're running every 2 weeks a vacancy rate somewhere on the order of about 3.3%. I think that's pretty good for a very talented team that has an option to work not just anywhere in the state, but anywhere in the country. That's the kind of talent that we have here. And so we have a vacancy rate of about 3.3%. We are continuing to attract high quality candidates. So I'm not concerned about that just yet.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for joining us for Biz Talk, and for our viewers and listeners, thank you also. And we'll be back next Thursday with our next edition. Take care.
Thank y'all.
Thanks.